Naxal attacks as well as the efforts to counter them. But in fact, I believe Parliament was scheduled to discuss the subject today, and Jay was supposed to be part of it, but since Parliament got adjourned, good luck, we have to pass. And what's emerging out there, if you look at it a little dispassionately, is that there is a dual India which seems to be emerging from this debate that we are seeing. It's a kind of, the question is that, whether it's integrating at all or if it's happening is not perfect. The narrative that's emerging is about haves and have-nots. So, and to tackle this issue as well as the associated questions, we have with us a very good panel. We have Jay Panda, who's a member of Lok Sabha. We have Manoj, who heads a non-profit, who does 50% of his work in these Naxal-affected areas, and so hugely experienced from the ground level up. Then we have Somini, who is the bureau chief, currently bureau chief on leave, former bureau chief of New York Times, right now on leave to write a non-fiction book on India. So we should all look forward to it. And at the end we have Sugata, who is the assistant editor at Outlook, associate editor at Outlook, and hugely experienced in covering these extremist movements at the ground level. So we have two journalists, and we have two others who can give us an expert view. So the way we have structured it is that I requested each of the speakers to go for 5 minutes on setting the issues. Okay, begin with Jay, particularly because his state is one of the afflicted areas, and his own experience as a politician and as a policy planner as to what he can share with us are the core causes of this problem.
Thank you. I'd like to be very brief. I'd like to spend more time at the end on the Q&A. Just to give a little backdrop about the experience from my state in Orissa. 1 out of every 4 citizens is tribal, which adds up to 10 million tribals. Now, traditionally, Orissa has not been the center of Naxalite activity. It's been a transit area. We've had much greater Naxalite activity in neighboring states, in particular Andhra Pradesh and in Chhattisgarh. But everybody talks about this corridor, which leads all the way up to perhaps Nepal, and Orissa has been a part of that corridor. In the last 4 years or so, there was a very sharp increase in Naxalite activity. And if you trace back the roots of most of this activity, whether in Orissa or other states, it's very clear that the state, and I don't mean my state, I mean the government, obviously failed to reach out, failed to reach many parts of the country. And if you see the condition of the infrastructure, if you see the condition of governance in many of these places, it should come as no surprise that some people wouldn't take it anymore. I remember when I first came to Parliament 10 years ago, we had debates on the issue of starvation deaths in certain parts of the state. And there were villages in parts of my state which the government had not seen for years, had not touched for years, and was not in a position to reach quickly enough to provide any kind of relief if there was a drought, if there was any kind of a crisis. There were many villages that were weeks away from any kind of government contact. Now, the problem happens is when Naxalism is explained away by this sole perspective, that because of governmental failure, it's justified for the kind of action that the Naxal movement has taken. I describe this the original sin. I call this the original sin, because it was governmental failure that has provided the platform for this activity to take up. So the debate that we have today in the Indian polity is, do we just use the stick? Do we go after Naxals with more boots on the ground, with more paramilitary forces, or do we go for development? And the divide that happens is, of course, there is a very strong civil society movement in India which favors the developmental angle. And there is a very strong security group, if you will, which favors military or paramilitary action? The answer is a bit more complex in my view, and the reason is that I have, from my experience, I've seen that the Naxal movement has gone to such a level that just by providing developmental activity in those areas is not working, because it is being actively opposed, tooth and nail. When the government tries to build roads, they are blocked, they are shot at, they are sent scurrying away from there. When the government tries to reach there to build schools or hospitals, the same thing. So it's easier said than done when you say that we should just focus on taking development there and overcome Naxalism, because development is being resisted tooth and nail. There are steps that are being taken now. At the parliament level, people from states like mine have been frustrated for many years when we used to hear for many years that this is a state level problem. The central government can do very little about it. That attitude has changed, and the attitude that the central government is now taking is to prepare the big stick. Lots of paramilitary forces are being prepared, lots of equipment is being readied, and a major action is being now ready to roll out in the next few months. My own personal opinion is it can't be either carrot or stick, it has to be both. There has to be, unfortunately, a great element of stick, because some of it has worked. In neighboring states like Andhra Pradesh, when the government geared up and started taking a great deal of preventive and aggressive action, it has led to the reduction of Naxalite activities and destruction of government property, and the return of governance in some measure to some of those areas. But you can't do it in pockets, because you do it in one pocket, you push the problem to another part. That's what has happened in Odisha. Because of the crackdown in places like Andhra Pradesh, and because of the government and related programs like the Salwa Judu program in Chhattisgarh, you just pushed the problem into other areas like Odisha, where it used to be a transient problem. It became a much more serious problem. So the approach is, how do we go about it? My state government, of which my party is the governing party there, the approach we've taken is that we have to actually back both approaches. So as far as the government gearing up to take military action, we support it. But also, we now want to step up every way we can think of taking more developmental activities to the regions affected by Naxalism. For example, where roads and school constructions and all are being aggressively blocked by the Naxalites, we are now going to take the help of paramilitary forces. We are going to take the help of organizations like the BRO, the Border Roads Organization, which is used to building roads in very hostile conditions, to bring that investment, that infrastructure and governmental presence into those areas. So in conclusion, short answer is you can't approach it with a single perspective. You have to have different approaches, and it has to involve both carrot and stick.
Manoj, you heard Jay, it's I think brilliant start to a discussion, because he's put it in some perspective. So Manoj is actually just back from his field visit to Chhattisgarh, right? And so you can share your experience from the ground up, and also what you think is the reason behind this.
I didn't come directly from Chhattisgarh to Delhi. I came via Hyderabad, where there was a whole discussion going on about dividing the state, Andhra Pradesh, into two. So what provokes me to start the whole discussion is on the aspect that, I think in the last 4 years, and taking on from Jay, while we have seen some discussions on states getting disintegrated or divided, the latest being the Andhra Pradesh one, I think there has been what I would like to sort of provoke and say a quite reorganization of states happening. I think the largest state, to my mind, in the sense of the geopolitical powers that would affect the lives of poor people are concerned, is happening in what is popularly known as the Red Corridor. Which I would say is from Pashupati and Nepal to Tirupati in Andhra Pradesh. The whole corridor is getting reorganized. Whether it's paramilitary forces reorganizing themselves there, or whether it is government targeting some developmental programs, or it's just the Maoists reorganizing. They loosely call Maoists, by the way. To me, it's just people who represent a certain new political strata in this country itself. So I think we need to, and it's relevant we look into it, because we work, the foundation that I represent works in something like over the 2,000 villages which are part of this, what is popularly known the Red Corridor, as I said. And I can tell you for sure that even if to go by, I mean, I know Jay as a friend, also we share passion on the hunger and malnutrition thing and we go to similar places, but I think the governance that is understood as governance, and if at all an effort that is coming up in all these places, is more in terms of, for want of a better word, infrastructure. I mean, the idea of building a school and idea of building a road is not what the tribals or the Adivasis in this region are worried about. They are convinced even before you build it that it won't provide education. They are convinced the Anganwadi won't give the food. They are convinced that the hospital you are going to build will not provide the healthcare because the PHCs have not been functioning, Anganwadis have not been functioning, and the schools have never had a teacher. So, considering that there has been a lack of the service provision part, you know, they've created such a momentum, the movement, the Naxal movement, in that region with the communities that even if you plan a developmental work which is going to be sort of counterproductive for their activities, they want to ensure that communities are not provided with that basic infrastructure, and not having roads is the best way to keep them cut off. So to me there is a fundamental issue of we having as a country neglected this region from basic services. If you look at these places, these are exactly the places where you will have maximum malnourished districts. If you create as per the latest National Family Health Survey, NFHS2 data that you have, the 150 blocks where there are maximum malnourished children in the country, you will find that they very much, you know, a Venn diagram will plot you that they clash exactly with the Red Corridor blocks in each of the states that we are talking. So that is a clear indicator that these services were not reaching. And we somehow miss out the point that infrastructure is probably the solution. And to me, the lack of service, and I think sort of maybe it will take a time, but I think governments have become, in all these places, incapable of now rendering that service, which is different from a political will, which is different from investment outlay. It's about the outcome. And I think that missing link, unless you create a bridge, I think you will find more and more of this movement catching up. That's one point that I have to make. I mean, just to give classic example, all these places that we work and go around looking, even this much popular NREGA scheme, even in a remote sense, has not reached any of them for getting just the basic right to food or the right to work, you know, wages that we have been talking about. So there is a complete lack of any form of basic service, education, malnutrition, that is food, Anganwadi services, basic healthcare. Most of these places are characterized by PHCs that exist, which don't function. So, along with the development is this whole angle of looking at how do we reach services. The second point is, unfortunately or fortunately, this is also the area which has been both the cohabitation for indigenous people as well as, you know, very rich minerals and resources. So you have entire, you know, mining belts that we are talking about, which is an easy thing for the Naxals to bring out as a potential discussion point for the community to look at. And just by threatening itself displacement, I personally know, including in Orissa and Chhattisgarh, etc., there are certain places where there is a genuine case of mining threatening their natural resources and their livelihood, but a lot of places where it's the activity would make zero displacement, but is still opposed by the community to such an extent that, you know, it's very clearly backed by a certain you know, information that has been penetrated by the Naxals over a period of time. So I think the fact that there is rich mineral resources on one hand under the soil and completely impoverished indigenous people who, you know, in a sense are Adivasis, the first inhabitants of this region, living without having any access to resources, is classic raw material to convert into RDX as far as the mind war is concerned for the Naxals. So I think we have let such a situation evolve, and we're talking now suddenly because we have a strong polarization happening, and this divide, to my mind, if it is, and I agree with Jay on that part very strongly, that unfortunately we have reached the stage where we need to now do probably carrot and stick in a manner that, you know, the stick doesn't sort of, you know, wean away any effects that the carrot could probably produce, because it's very difficult to make a point by using just the armed suppression. So that's the tricky part, and how to win over the confidence of the community by saying that the government can actually deliver a service, to me remains the most question, and the more innovative hybrid solutions we can come out with, the better. And I'll rest with this sort of thought and then come back later.
Thank you, Manoj. Now we have, I would like to request Somini to address the issue. She's traveled extensively in Chhattisgarh and Bengal, so she can, as a journalist, also give a very agnostic view of what we have just been discussing.
Before I came to India to cover India, I covered West Africa. And in 2003, I went with an armed group to the Niger Delta, where there were lots of armed groups there then, and there are lots of armed groups now. And they put me on a motorboat, and they showed me their toys. They had very sophisticated weapons. They were in the habit of blowing up the oil rigs. They were in the habit of kidnapping oil executives. Their grievance was very similar to the grievance that I've heard the panelists talk about here. Natural resources, we're not getting any. It's threatening our livelihood. Our schools don't work. Our healthcare system doesn't work. They certainly were not Maoists. They had none of that ideology to rest on. They had an ethnic grievance, and they were very, very violent. In 2006, in the summer of 2006, I made a trip to Chhattisgarh, and after many attempts, I went to meet with some of these Naxalite leaders there. And as Manoj said, it was much of the same. There was a lot of anxiety, some of it realistic, some of it unrealistic, about displacement due to mining and other activities. I think that generally, where you have riches under the ground, you're likely to see a lot of blood on the ground, unless governments figure out a way to deal with it. This is an extremely thorny problem. It doesn't necessarily explain in and of itself why there's a Maoist corridor, why there's a red corridor in India. I think the issues of the lack of governance, poverty, partly explains it. The scramble for mineral wealth partly explains it. And the only third point that I would like to add is India's demographics. We're talking about a population that is overwhelmingly young, that has huge ambitions for the future, and a young population, particularly a young male population, combined with poverty, a feeling of lack of opportunity, a feeling that India's advance is going to pass them by. That's a very, very deadly combination.
When friends here have spoken, have given the ground perspective, I think I'll slightly try and give a theoretical perspective on the problem. But before that, I'm slightly provoked by what Jay said. I just will first react to that and then perhaps go on elaborating. Jay said, we'll have to use both the carrot and the stick and a little bit more of the stick.
Yeah, I didn't say that. I said both.
Yeah, more of the stick. I think you said it. You said it has worked in Andhra Pradesh.
No, it's more of stick. I said both are necessary.
Both are necessary because in the Andhra experiment is a slightly interesting case because I cover Andhra for the Outlook. In Andhra Pradesh, what has happened is they flushed out all the Maoists out of the Nalamala forest and other places, and as a result, the people leading Maoist movements outside Andhra Pradesh now the leaders are all from Andhra Pradesh. People who are leading movements in Jharkhand, in Chhattisgarh, parts of Orissa and other places, the brain has sort of are people who were trained in Andhra Pradesh in the Maoist method. But getting back to the topic of today, basically, I'll try and sort out the title first. It's slightly a curious title because Naxalism and Adivasi Disquiet are not two sides of the same coin, according to me. Because on the contrary, Adivasi Disquiet is only a strategic entry point for the Maoists.
I think the microphone needs to be pulled out.
I'll try and sort out the title of today's discussion, obviously. And I very strongly feel that Naxalism and Adivasi Disquiet are not two sides of the same coin. On the contrary, the Adivasi Disquiet is only a strategic entry point for the Maoists or the Naxals to wage their revolutionary war. In other words, it's just a peg on which the Adivasi Disquiet is a peg on which they hang their ideology. So it's very important to make this distinction, because today we seem to have linked up Naxals, and we speak of Naxals and tribals in the same breath. I would like to argue that if say for instance, the army was working in these areas, the color of the tribals would not be red but saffron. As we have seen in the Udaipur corridor, in the Gujarat and Rajasthan, Gujarat, the border has a lot of tribal population, and there the VHP is very active. So the color of the tribals there is not red as we tend to think, but it's saffron on the contrary. And we also have to realize that the Naxals have decided on, capitalizing the discontent among Naxals only in the recent years. They have been trying to cultivate them, but we should also know that they try to make capital out of the discontent that was there in daily wage laborers and slum dwellers and urban poor and all that, and they failed. In fact, there was a very classic case, because I come from Karnataka, and there's this classic case in Hyderabad, Karnataka region. People, they tried to organize daily wage laborers and poor peasants in the Hyderabad, Karnataka region, by the way, is an extension of Telangana, the most impoverished, one of the most impoverished areas in India, and they failed there. And the main reason that they offered for that was that the terrain was not conducive. So, which clearly shows that the Naxals don't have an altruistic agenda towards the Adivasis. They're not trying to sort of do any good for them, but it's just that it serves them really well to sort of hide in your forests and build their guerrilla bases. So that is an important kind of a distinction that I wanted to make, because most of you here have spoken from the ground, and I thought I'll just highlight that little bit of element about how the Maoists really operate. In fact, I recently accessed a confidential paper which was prepared by a Maoist leader in Karnataka who was shot down. His name was Saket Rajan. He was said to be a very dreaded Naxalite and all that, but a very, very sharp mind. And I was just reading this paper and I could access it, and it very clearly says, I just read out a small little passage which makes it clear that it's only a strategic interest that these people have in tribals and not any altruistic kind of purpose. So it clearly says that these regions, which means the forest regions, have strategic importance for Indian revolution from the military viewpoint due to their favorable terrain that facilitates the establishment of guerrilla zones. So it's not that Maoists have, and Maoists have not suddenly landed in the forest and we started, operating with the Naxals. They've been working in those areas. If you read this paper, it's very, very clear as to the minute details that they have picked up from their research. So in this particular area, that's the Malnad region, the Western Ghat region, which runs 700 kilometers in Karnataka. They have done such minute research that they know the debt burden of every single family in about 1,000 villages. That is the kind of research that they've done, and they really have, applied their minds, and they're not some kind of rogue, violent, whatever gangs that operate in the forest. They do apply a lot of their brain. That's something that I thought I should bring to the table before we sort of go a little further and discuss other issues.
Okay. Kind of laid the basis for what we could take forward as a discussion. So all the four panelists believe we should take it forward in an interactive manner. And but just before I throw it open to the audience, I just wanted to, I was very piqued by his point, which he's saying that the Naxalites are ideologically committed to something else beyond the welfare of the subjects for which they ostensibly have launched these violent attacks. So, as an immediate question, it just begs to what is it exactly that they are looking at? What is it that they are aspiring for? So if you could
I'd like to just very quickly touch on two things, 2 points made by Somni and Shivata. Somni mentioned the ethnic tensions that she'd seen in other parts, and there is a great similarity in India. In my state, for instance, last year we had religious riots, which behind the religious riots, underlying issues were ethnic tensions that go back many decades, because non-tribals who moved into these areas have manipulated the system, acquired tribal lands which are ostensibly illegal, and they have had clashes going on there, which are basically between tribal and non-tribal, and then have become more complicated with the involvement of religious angles. So there is that background, and in fact, to touch Shivata's point, the religious angle was brought about precisely because of VHP involvement there. The tribals in Kandhamal, Orissa, do not represent the extreme left ideology that we've seen in other parts. And the other point I want to make is that you cannot, I agree, equate tribal Adivasi populations with the Naxalites. There is a very significant distinction, and in my opinion, the tribal populations are usually caught between a rock and a hard place, rather than being unilaterally supportive of one ideology or the other. So that's the concept.
I'm curious what you thought of what you were saying, because you are working with these people and the tribals.
No, I'll make only 2 points. I'll again speak on for the Adivasis for the reason I work with them more closely. One point is, for instance, in all these places, if you go and talk to the families and the households, to take the last point between rock and the hard place, if they even remotely try to oppose the Naxals will create a problem for them. But if they are even at least indifferent to them, then next day harassed by the police, saying that you gave shelter, you're a sympathizer, and your cases are booked against you. I mean, this is technically, in a sense, not necessarily the political will of the state per se, but the police system is such that they have to have numbers, cases registered. There is a whole set of statistics they have to work for, and therefore they are under pressure to do this. And at their level, there is enough circumstantial evidence to say that the Naxal was there, sheltered the previous night, and therefore they have to be arrested. So at the Adivasi level, at the indigenous people level, it's a question of neither do they get services from anybody, and at the same time, if they're just thrust between these two. I mean, they're really sandwiched in a level that my plight is that when I work with them, including us, the discussion is Naxals, because Adivasis don't affect us. Naxals affect us. So I would urge for us to think that it's time we talk from their perspective, so that we look at it from a different angle altogether. So the fact that none of the discussions are about, or the media reporting is never about the lack of basic services, but it's about how much Naxal activism took place in those regions, and I think that's helping the whole thing to be looked at a different angle. That's one. And the second point is, in Chhattisgarh, in Dantewad and Kanker region, the erstwhile Bastar district, for example, less in Kanker, but more in Bastar and Dantewad, if you see. Even now, a girl will be sold by the family for as little as 5 to 10,000 rupees to become an Naxal. The schools don't exist. There is an income in the form of this. Instead of we giving a school uniform and a kit, you get an arms kit, and you are trained, you are empowered, and the family is taken care of. And anyway, life was meant to be short for these people. So there is an active recruitment process happening. There is an active movement happening, which to me is just another way of usurping power, which includes both resources as well as political power. And most of them are looking this as another way of doing it. I mean, it's the bullet route of one, which is very strategically maneuvered. I recently read some of the examples. We don't work there in Jharkhand, where there is a small instance of Naxals trying to come and fight elections, and these are often the disillusioned lot who couldn't get power through the bullet route. But the underpinning thing that we see is there has been a need for some form of power, some form of recognition, and that is well orchestrated, given the fact that we as state, we as society have allowed communities that they coexist with to just go without any form of basic service?
Actually, I mean, I would like to add to what Manoj was. He's already taken this name Dantewada, which is perhaps the most printed word in recent history. Dantewada and Lalgarh, of course. There are two very interesting cases. Actually, one of completely helpless Naxals in Dantewada, and in Lalgarh, very organized. In what happened in around 2005 in Dantewada is when the Chhattisgarh government realized that the Maoists had entered the forests. They created the Salwa Judum and they wanted to segregate the Maoists from the tribals. So you'll be surprised to know that they started camps outside the forests and shifted people from about 1,000 villages to these camps. There were at one given point of time, there were 54,000 people living in these camps. People were sort of, around that time, Raman Singh, who was the chief minister, who was still the chief minister of Chhattisgarh, made a very bush-like comment. He said, people living in the camps are with us, and people who want to go back to their homes or go back to the forests are with the Naxalites. So, I completely agree with what Jay said, that rock and a hard place kind of a logic. They have become a grain for a millstone between the police and the Naxals. So that is one interesting thing that has happened in the recent past. But the Lalgarh thing, the Lalgarh movement, which has its genesis in November 2008, as they try to point it out, after there was a landmine blast following the visit of Ramvilas Paswan and the chief minister of West Bengal to a Jindal factory. The police attacked a number of villages, kicked women, pregnant women, a lot of people died and all that. And after that, a very effective resistance movement has been built in Lalgarh. And traditionally Lalgarh, because I've also traveled to those areas. Traditionally Lalgarh is not sympathetic to Maoists. It's Purulia and other regions which surround Lalgarh, but not Lalgarh itself. So these two very interesting things, about how in one particular area the Naxals have been successful in cultivating the Adivasis. In Lalgarh, there was recently, just about a couple of weeks ago, there was a funeral procession passing through a particular village. And the villagers stopped the funeral procession. It was of a CPM worker. And they asked the police to just get away from that place. They said, we will not allow the police to enter the villages. They're extremely organized. And in the last 6 months, not a single policeman, at least going by media reports, have been able to enter these villages. So that's the kind of, they've been organized in such a fashion by the Naxals in the Lalgarh area. But in Dantewada, they feel very helpless. But they're actually caught between a rock and a hard place.
Held up for a variety of reasons, and one of the reasons is that there is very heavy Naxal activity in some of those districts.
But what about investing in infrastructure in water? Locally available water sources. I don't see that coming up anywhere in the dire needs. We still have starvation deaths in Noapada and Kalahandi.
Yes, I'm quite sure there are many kinds of investments that are necessary that have not yet been addressed. But that doesn't mean that these major roads and infrastructure projects are not required. They're desperately required. And they have been blocked for years now because of these Naxal activities. So that is why I believe that you will need to do both. You will need to ensure that these roads are built despite opposition from armed militants. And of course we will need to build water sources and all other kinds of developmental activity as well.
Anil, may I ask a question of Jay?
Sure.
Roughly how much in private investment is right now threatened by Naxalite activity in Orissa?
I'll give you an example. Now, Odisha has traditionally been at the bottom in terms of investment, in terms of socio-economic indices, in terms of social indices. In the last decade, there's been a very dramatic turnaround. We've got something like 85,000 crores actually invested on the ground. That's roughly about $20 billion. We have had MOUs, memorandums of understanding, for about $100 billion. Now, I don't know how much of the balance is held up on account of Naxalite activity and how much is held up on account of economic downturn. But obviously, some part of the 400,000 crores is held up because of issues like land acquisition, issues like Naxal opposition. So there is a fair amount. But the fact that we've got these $20 billion on the ground has made a huge difference, because that is an order of magnitude higher than what happened in the previous half century. In fact, our election campaign was that we've got 10 times more investment in 5 years compared to the previous 55. And has it had an impact? It's beginning to. Because you can't take the state at the bottom of the heap and expect it to become #1 in 5 years. But we've started going up the ranks in certain aspects. For example, malnutrition, an issue on which Manoj and I and several other people work together. The country as a whole is barely improving, but a few states are, and Odisha is at the top of the ones that are improving. It's had the single largest improvement in malnutrition for children. It's had improvement in infant mortality. So there is an improvement happening, but if you step back and you look at the macro picture, you recognize that it's going to take 20 years for it to have a broad enough impact to help everybody.
You've been a wonderful audience. You can all take it offline too, because some of the speakers will be around. So those of you who want to follow up, thank you very much again. Thank you.